Hello, everybody. This is Ethan Summer again here with the NextGen Sobriety podcast and the Scott Summer Sobriety program. How are y'all doing today? So I am sitting here again with our clinical director, Neil Summer. Neil Summer, how are things?
Doing well today, Ethan. Thank you. A little frog in the throat, but
That's okay. Hopefully he escapes here for you. Today we are going to be continuing kind of our last session. We kind of touched on the idea of trauma and how it relates to, addiction, how treatment factors into the equation, or how trauma factors into treatment of addiction. Let's just connect all the dots there.
Yeah.
And so I really want to elaborate. We very briefly touched on this last time, and I believe we alluded to continuing this conversation. So here we are continuing this conversation here. So one of the things I really want to get into is, at least as a foundation for what we're going to be talking about, is how does different trauma tend to lead to addiction? What does that kind of correlation look like?
well, I think the word trauma is misunderstood quite a bit. People think they know it. It's one of those words that you really think you know what it is. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is talked about a lot in terms of sexual abuse, physical abuse, people coming back from war zones. So what is a trauma? It's really important to understand trauma if you're going to understand how it relates to addiction. And my best understanding of trauma is that it's an exceptional pain. Exceptional meaning much worse than sort of a transitional pain or an escalating pain. It's a pain of extraordinary proportions, of such a nature that the brain literally shuts down in order to protect the person's experience of it.
Gotcha.
There are theories and there are medical papers and research that would suggest that a person's psychological and physical well-being can literally be horribly compromised if the brain weren't capable of shutting down during that particular experience. Trauma, like any other pain, comes in various levels of discomfort or extreme response. And so a trauma, unfortunately, is an experience that creates in the human being an incredible change that was not there prior to the experience of trauma.
Okay.
And I'll jump just a little bit ahead and let you know that addiction tends to be a response to that change.
Gotcha.
Especially as it relates to a re-experience of the pain when certain triggers in one's life remind of the original experience. Now, when I say experience, some people live in traumatic circumstances. They may grow up in a home in which sexual abuse is routine, or where physical and emotional abuse is routine. In cases like this, the level of addiction tends to be much more profound and tends to begin at a much earlier age than if a person were to say experience they're on a trip on Amtrak, it derails, several people are killed, you experience that, or the 9/11, the 7/11 trauma that we all have been subject
God, they were
to.
out of Slurpees, guys. It was a crazy time.
I'm going to get sued if I go down that little. The 9/11 trauma, that was a national trauma.
Yeah.
It was a national trauma. It really was. So trauma and addiction, alcoholism and drug addiction, are very interwoven. Does a person who experiences trauma always develop an addiction? No, not at all. There are several factors that go into how a person responds to trauma, and each one of us is built with a certain resiliency to traumatic events. And so one event may be horrifically traumatizing to one individual, and another person may be not that affected.
Yeah.
So I know I'm going on, but first responders. firefighters, police officers tend to have developed a resistance because they experience trauma on a daily basis.
They have to be sensitive.
Trauma is also witnessing other people's trauma. It's called vicarious trauma. It's the experience of trauma by the witnessing of, or the viewing of, or the being involved with other human beings. And it's traumatizing because we're connected. You know, and as a person, you would know what that would be like if it was you, which is a terrifying experience. And so, just jumping ahead, addiction is always an effort to dissociate or to disconnect from the memories of the traumas, the experience of the traumas, the stimulation in the environment from the traumas. I remember years ago, a little personal story. I was dating a young lady. This was a long time ago. I'm just saying that as a disclaimer, by the way. I won't mention.
Decades.
Yeah. It was 7 years ago. And I wore a particular cologne that this young lady just had a terrible reaction to.
Okay.
Not so much that she didn't, she didn't like the cologne, but it was a. You
have terrible cologne taste? Is that what?
I think that's fair to say. But the cologne reminded her of being sexually molested by an individual that was wearing that particular cologne.
Okay.
And so her response to me wasn't much different, and came as a shock to me until it was figured out. And I'll be honest with you, at that point, I quit wearing cologne. I thought, why carry a stimulus into a situation where I don't know how it's going to impact a person?
Yeah.
And so it's a great topic.
So
it really has a essence into one of the primary drivers behind chronic addictive behavior.
Yeah, gotcha. So we've kind of touched on what I wanted to ask as my next question, but I'm going to try and have you elaborate a little bit if there is any more elaboration. So what are different, I'd say, categories of trauma? So the three that we've touched on so far would be like a PTSD style trauma. That's that train derail, that instant sensation, something happens.
Dramatic, terrible experience that the brain and the body cannot reconcile.
Exactly. So
you can reconcile transitional discomfort or transitional bad situations. We all have bad situations, but the traumatic experience is that one in which your mind, your brain, your soul, and your body are just absolutely in a state of disbelief at the same time that it's experiencing extraordinary
stress
pain and stress. So, for example, real quick, and I know if you're a soldier and you're in a combat zone, is that traumatic in and of itself? Not necessarily, because there's a certain desensitization to that experience. But as soon as you watch your best friend, who you've gone through training with, and you've been here, you see that individual killed 2 feet from you, that may be the experience that
rocks your foundation.
Exactly. This, by the way, is why the military and the police and the firefighters and anybody that is in proximity to trauma train so much. It's a desensitization. So with trauma, you're not desensitized. Just jumped into a bathtub and it was 40 degrees in temperature. It would be horrific.
Shock.
But believe it or not, you can train a person to eventually tolerate without much of a reaction to 40 degrees. I mean, that may be too cold, maybe 50 degrees. You can desensitize a person to being able to adapt to that.
Yeah.
So, the reason this is important is because it is not the event so much that is traumatizing. It's the individual experiencing the event that makes all the difference. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I think I made a comparison in our last session together, where me as an individual, I could walk through my house and I'm very fresh, not experienced in life, and I stub my toe and I break my toe, and that's this traumatic thing for me. And this is trauma that sits with me for the rest of my life, and I might not realize it. I think the exact comment I made was, now I might not like sitting at coffee tables. Like, when I don't know why I don't like to eat at a coffee table, and I don't know why this is, because I broke my toe when I was, 15 years old, and that was traumatic for me.
Yes.
Within that time frame, within who I was and what was going on in my life, where most people are going to stub their toe and not think about it 20 minutes later. For me, that was traumatizing, and I experienced trauma, whereas somebody else could, they work in a factory and they're around heavy machinery and they get the tip of their finger cut off, or they get a finger cut off. And, they've been in this situation for so long, they've seen so many different people. It's not necessarily traumatizing to that individual.
Exactly.
That individual goes through something that, you might consider horrendous, and they immediately stop. They take the right steps. They move forward. They fix themselves, and they just move on with their life. And so it just goes to show that the same trauma doesn't affect different people in the same way. It's person to person.
Well, the definition of trauma is what happens to the person. So it's an experience, like a train coming off the rails and people being killed and screaming and children dying and just things that are horrific, or a school shooting, or any number of things. You might say, well, is that in and of itself a traumatic experience? Technically, it isn't. It's an experience that's unbelievably dramatic.
Yeah.
Is it likely that the people in that situation would be traumatized? Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. Think about, it would be the event. The event is incredibly dramatic. It's incredibly out of the norm.
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously.
Exactly.
And the people that are experiencing it are very likely to be traumatized. There are very few people that are going to get out of that one without being traumatized. And so the trauma is that the experience is an extraordinary one for the individual.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's really just an extraordinary, dramatic, terrifying, terrible experience, then you could say most people in that area would be traumatized by it, or they would be deeply affected by it. Mm-hmm. But it is really important to understand that there's no such thing as a universal terrifying experience, because this is where I see a lot of diagnostics go wrong in psychology, in which the evaluator is determining what's traumatic and what isn't. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Rather than
the client.
And I've seen clinicians trying to dig at what would seem, well, you were sexually abused, but were you raped, or were you abused against your will, or were you injured? Well, no, I wasn't injured, but it was terrible.
Yeah,
well, without injury, really, it's that bad,
Yeah.
You get what I'm saying?
I get exactly.
It's like, look, dude, unless you are the person experiencing whatever you're experiencing in that moment,
mm-hmm.
nobody gets to call it a trauma except for you.
Exactly. Nobody can determine how that affected your mental state,
mental, emotional,
and your mental and emotional,
and physical.
Yeah. Go back to my earlier question, which is different categories of trauma. So that what we've just kind of covered. That's one category of trauma. That's kind of the instant event situation that causes trauma. Then we touched on, like a long-term event, like you said, sexual molestation over the course of years,
right.
or physical, emotional abuse over years in the
right.
family, things like that. So that's going to be more of like a long-term traumatic experience.